So assignment 4.1 is ethical and legal issues. Between ethical and legal. So ethics, or being ethical, so ethics are moral principles that kind of like govern an individual's behaviour or like the conducting of an activity. It's almost like what's right versus what's wrong. So if you're being ethical, you're not causing any physical or emotional harm to anyone else. Obviously in World War II, prisoners of the Nazi party, and because obviously the reign of the Nazis was in World War II, World War II Nazi prisoners were used for research experiments by the Nazis. They were used against their own will. They didn't have a choice. They were used for really unethical and inhumane experiments and studies, subjected to like physical and emotional harm and pain, as well as even death. So obviously, as the most common group of people were the Jewish people who were targeted by the Nazis. However, after World War II, the Nuremberg Code was put in place. So it's just sort of 10 points that everyone should consider when humans are participating in research. So the 10 points are as follows. So the human subject that is actually taking part in the research should have given voluntary consent, so they must be able to give consent, and they should be informed of the nature of the experiment. The next one is the experiment should be giving useful results that will go towards the good of society. The experiment should be designed and based off of a knowledge of natural history. It shouldn't be conducted if there's reason to believe that death or disability or an injury that will cause disability will occur. It should be conducted to avoid any unnecessary physical and mental suffering or injury. The degree of risk shouldn't be higher than the humanitarian importance of the problem that's going to be solved by the experiment. So the risk shouldn't be very high. Proper precautions should be taken, and adequate facilities should be provided. It should be conducted by obviously a scientifically qualified person. The subject should be at liberty to end the experiment at any point where they might feel uncomfortable. So they do have that right to withdraw from the test at any point. And also the scientist, obviously leading on from that one, the scientist must be prepared to terminate the test at any given point. In 1964 was the Helsinki Declaration, which is just a set of principles that all researchers must abide by, and it was produced by the World Medical Association. So everyone must abide by the principles. So then the difference from that to legal is just simply working within the boundaries of the civil law, so making sure you're working within the law. Okay, so scenario 1. So a gymnastics coach has told his group of gymnasts that they are going to take part in an experiment into whether the body mass index of a gymnast affects their ability to perform skills such as handsprings, walkovers and various other jumps. The coach had all the girls in his group complete a health screening questionnaire prior to the study. The gymnasts had to complete these skills in a very small space due to the majority of the sports hall being booked up. The procedure of the experiment is explained clearly to each one of the participants within an informed consent form. Once the experiment is completed, the data is published onto the website of the researcher. So from the first scenario, the good practice was that they had informed consent. So within the form, it includes the purpose and description of the procedure, any potential risks and how they're going to be minimised, but also any medical treatment that's going to be available if injuries do occur, the benefits from the research, where the data is going to be going, and that it will be kept confidential, and a statement from the participant stating, that they're, volunteering and that they can withdraw at any point. It doesn't deceive, and there is a health screening questionnaire which aims to identify any health issues that the participant has or that potentially run in the family of the participant, for example, heart disease, etc., as well as things like previous injuries as well. So some of the bad things within the scenario is that they weren't actually volunteers. So a volunteer is someone who's willing to take part in an experiment, so it's their choice, they choose to do this. Some volunteers do receive payments, but a participant has to be a volunteer, so they can't be forced to take part. Confidentiality, obviously within the informed consent form, it didn't contain what it should have done because they weren't volunteers, and obviously we've got the confidentiality issue here. So being confidential is just keeping data about the participants private, especially when they might find it harmful in some ways. For example, whether it has anything to do with their health or even if they just find it embarrassing. They must be shown respect and be dealt with in a professional manner. Also, if data is going to be published, they should keep it confidential. So health and safety was an issue because activity was performed in a small space which could have caused injury. So HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, 1999, they used the 5-step approach when it comes to health and safety. So the 5 steps is identifying the hazards, who's at risk and how, evaluating the risks, so putting any control measures in place which could minimise the risk, recording any findings, and then reviewing the assessment as well as changing it if necessary in places. A risk assessment should also have been put together for the session. This could have identified any potential risks as well as the controls that are being put in place to minimise them, and their risk rating, which is based on the likelihood of it happening and the seriousness of the outcome if it did happen. These risk assessments have to be involved for any activity that's going to take place. And then the consequences of this bad practice, so the results being shared and potentially the BMI of the children being shared could cause social or emotional harm to the participant. They could become really insecure about the results of their test. Also, fines or a prison sentence for breaching, the Data Protection Act, which we'll talk about later, for publishing the data of the participants. They're liable for the publication of confidential information. There's no clarification of where this data is going to be going. And then potential suspension from the job. So for scenario 2, an experiment into the lactate threshold of 2 different types of gymnasts, floor and uneven bar gymnasts, was conducted. Throughout the experiment, there was regular blood samples taken from the 14 to 16-year-old volunteers. All the volunteers had to complete a PAR-Q prior to the test. When the newly qualified researcher who was conducting the experiment explained the procedure, they didn't make the volunteers aware of the fact that the lactate would be measured using blood samples. However, they did have the right to withdraw from the experiment at any given moment. So, good practice from the scenario was that a PAR-Q was completed. So, this is the physical activity readiness questionnaire. It's just things about previous injuries, any medical issues really with the participants. Good again that they all were volunteers, so they weren't being forced to do it, and that they had a right to withdraw from the test. So right to withdraw from the experiment at any point that they may begin to feel uncomfortable with what they're asking to do. Bad practice, however, is that there was deception. So deception is when the participant is lied or misled. So lied to or misled. There's 2 different types. So omission deception is known as passive deception. So if someone was to miss out one piece of information, or there's commission deception, which is when the participant is actively misled. So in this scenario, it was omission deception because they just left out one piece of information, whereas everything else was, written in bold. Everything else was obviously clear. A research study should always give full disclosure, though, because, that's just when participants are informed of every sort of detailed study, so they know what they're in for and they know what to expect. If the study is based around deception, so if a placebo is being used, for example, then the researcher must debrief the participants as soon as the experiment finishes, just to inform them of any details or outcomes that they couldn't do at the beginning because of the nature of the test. So obviously as well, we've got lack of research competence, as it says, is that the newly qualified scientist who's conducting the test. So clearly they could be more qualified. They don't necessarily know what they're doing. So this goes with research responsibility, really. So the scientists must have knowledge and competence in their abilities. They must be confident with what they're doing. They must know what to do. So research responsibility is just that they have a responsibility for the well-being of the participant. They have to ensure that they have thought about potential ethical issues prior to the experiment and continue to monitor these throughout the study. And then again about being competent and also being respectful with in the way in which they handle the data, bearing in mind confidentiality of the participant. And also another bad thing is that there was no participant disclaimer. So participant disclaimer is just a short statement which is signed by the participant, showing that they understand the risks that the experiment carries, but they're still happy to take part. Also that they're not going to blame the researcher for any injuries that could be caused. That's probably the most important part of the disclaimer. So consequences obviously could be fined, because they did miss out the blood sample bit, and also there's no disclaimer, so they could get fined or sued. They could also lose accreditation. So this is by BASES. So BASES is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences. So all practitioners follow a strict code of conduct, so like protocols, consent forms that they have to have people fill out. They have to follow certain expectations and safety regulations, etc., etc. So basically just give credibility, which you only get if you're in line with these certain standards. So if you lose accreditation, an institution can be forced to close if it loses accreditation due to the violation of the certain standards that it should be upholding. It's going to close because it won't receive funding. This especially happens in schools, and obviously in these scenarios we're talking about young female gymnasts. So it will close because it won't receive the funding, because it's not going to be able to operate without the funding, basically. And then a loss of credibility, so what they're known for. So if a school loses its credibility, if example, a school loses its credibility, people aren't going to want to go there because it's lost its kind of status in a way. So for scenario number 3, the different age groups of secondary school gymnastics teams were taken on a spontaneous school trip without parental consent to the local leisure centre to meet a gymnastics coach. The coach wants to conduct an experiment to see whether the age of the participants has any impact on their flexibility of the muscles. But before they do this, they ensure that all the participants have completed a health screening questionnaire. Whilst the participants were performing the stretches, the coach would show annoyance towards those who weren't as flexible as others. Once the data was collected, the participants were told exactly what the results were and where they were going. They were being uploaded to a password-protected document.